The rain wasn't just falling. It was erasing the world 1 mile at a time. My headlights cut through the deluge, 2 cones of light fighting the dark, until they caught the glint of silver against the guardrail. A sedan, spun out and silent. I didn't think. I just reacted. The air brakes hissed, a sharp exhale that cut through the rhythm of the storm. I wasn't supposed to stop. Schedules are tight, and the pass to the hospital was already flooded out miles back. But the stillness inside that car terrified me more than the schedule. I pulled the brake. This wasn't just a detour. It was a fracture in the solitude I'd carefully built. A sudden, violent intrusion that demanded I step into the dark. My truck is a fortress of leather and diesel, a world I curated for precision. It smells of old coffee and the faint industrial tang of the engine, a scent that means movement, that means I am nowhere and everywhere at once. I have spent years perfecting this isolation, building walls out of highway miles and the hum of the tires. It's a deliberate architecture of silence, a way to keep the chaos of a loud life at bay. But the road has a way of dismantling your plans. Stepping out of that cab felt like opening an airlock in deep space. The wind hit me first, a physical weight against my chest, carrying the smell of ozone, wet pine, and something metallic, the sharp, copper scent of adrenaline that always seems to predate the disaster. The highway was empty, a black ribbon slick with oil, and for a moment, I felt the familiar pull of the void, that sense that the rest of the world had simply dissolved into the gray static of the rain. I walked toward the car, my boots heavy on the asphalt. Steam hissed from the sedan's crumpled hood, rising in ghostly twists that vanished into the downpour. Inside, the light from my truck washed over the driver. She looked impossibly fragile. She was wearing thin blue scrubs that offered no protection against the cold or the crash. Her hands were locked onto the steering wheel, knuckles white, tendons straining against skin that looked too pale, even in the harsh glare of the headlights. I tapped on the glass. Nothing. I tried the handle, and it gave way with a metallic groan. The sound of the storm rushed in, louder now, filling the small space of the car. She didn't turn. She didn't blink. It wasn't the stillness of death. I could see the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her chest, but the stillness of a mind that had retreated deep inside to survive. No blood. That was the first thing I checked for, my eyes scanning with the practiced efficiency of someone who has seen too many accidents on too many lonely roads. But no blood didn't mean safe. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding rough against the wind. "You need to look at me." She turned then, slowly, like the movement cost her something vital. Her eyes were wide, blown dark by shock, unfocused and searching for an anchor. I saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of her mouth, the kind of deep-seated fatigue that comes from fighting battles you can't win. She was an ER resident. I knew it from the scrubs, the stethoscope still draped around her neck like a talisman. But right now, she wasn't a doctor. She was just a woman, shivering in the wreckage of a night that had gone wrong. "I can't feel my hands," she whispered. The words were barely audible over the rain. "That's shock," I told her, keeping my voice low and steady, the way you speak to a frightened animal. "We need to get you warm. The pass is flooded. No ambulance is coming through that water tonight. You're coming with me." She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength. I reached in, unbuckling her seatbelt. It retracted with a snap that made her flinch. I slid my arm around her waist, feeling the damp cold of her scrubs seeping into my jacket. She was lighter than I expected, a bird-boned weight that felt wrong against the heavy industrial backdrop of the highway. I pulled her out, taking the brunt of her weight, my boots finding traction on the slick road. For a moment, we were just two shapes in the storm, connected by necessity and the fragility of the moment. I guided her toward the truck, shielding her from the worst of the wind with my own body. The climb up to the cab was steep, a vertical ascent into safety. I lifted her, my hands firm on her waist, her grip weak on my shoulders. When I finally got her settled into the passenger seat and slammed the heavy door shut, the silence was sudden and absolute. The storm was just a visual now, a chaotic movie playing on the other side of the glass. The heavy door sealed us inside, and the vast emptiness of the road narrowed down instantly to the sound of 2 breaths, mine, steady and controlled, and hers, ragged and terrified. The passenger seat of my truck had been a demilitarized zone for years, a space occupied only by a crumpled road atlas, a cooler, and the accumulated silence of 1,000 miles. Placing Claire there felt like a violation of that treaty, a sudden, jarring introduction of life into a capsule designed for endurance. As I buckled her in, the click of the latch sounded impossibly loud, a sharp punctuation mark in the quiet cab. I adjusted the heater, watching the vents blast warm air against her shivering frame. She looked lost against the worn leather, her form too slight, too broken for the industrial scale of the rig. This was a machine built to haul steel and timber through mountain passes, not to cradle a woman whose world had just shattered against a guardrail. I climbed into the driver's side, the suspension groaning under my weight, and for the first time, the cab felt small. The air, usually stale with coffee and diesel, now carried the sharp metallic tang of rain and the subtle, terrifying scent of her fear. The engine rumbled to life beneath us, a deep, resonant tremor that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into my own bones. The vibration stirred her. She blinked, her eyelids fluttering like moth wings, struggling to fix on the green glow of the dashboard lights. Then came the murmur, low, clinical, and disjointed. GCS 15. No, 13. Her hand fumbled weakly for her own wrist, fingers pressing into the pulse point with a trembling urgency. It was a reflex, a muscle memory buried deeper than the concussion. Even hurt, even half-conscious, she was trying to work. Pupils, sluggish, orient to time? She was diagnosing herself, stripping away the humanity of her own pain to turn it into data she could process. It was terrifying to watch, that desperate grasp for control in a situation that had spiraled completely out of her hands. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low, trying to modulate it to a frequency that wouldn't startle her. I eased the truck into gear, the tires fighting for grip on the slick asphalt. "You're safe. Just breathe." She turned to me then, panic flaring bright and hot behind the haze in her eyes. "Bed 4, she gasped, her hand shooting out to grip the door handle, knuckles turning white. "He's coding. I need the cart. Where is the cart?" She wasn't with me. She was back in the fluorescent purgatory of the ER, running on fumes and adrenaline, haunted by a ghost I couldn't see. "There is no bed 4, I told her, my voice firm, cutting through the fog. "You're in a truck. You crashed. I'm taking you somewhere safe." She slumped back, the fight draining out of her, as the reality of the rain-streaked windshield took hold. "Resident," she whispered, the word crumbling as it left her lips. 36 hours. I closed my eyes for a second. The confession hung in the air, heavy with guilt. I knew that exhaustion. I knew the way the white lines on the road could hypnotize you until your eyes burned and your brain simply shut down. The truck groaned as we hit the incline. The road to my cabin wasn't a highway. It was a suggestion of gravel carved into the tree line, currently turning into a mudslide under the assault of the storm. I needed both hands on the wheel, fighting the wind that tried to shove the trailer sideways, wrestling the beast of a machine to keep it true. But my attention was split. Every few seconds, my eyes flicked to her. The dashboard lights cast shadows across her face, highlighting the dark bruising starting to bloom along her jawline. The engine's hum, usually my lullaby, felt aggressive now, too loud for someone so fragile. She went quiet, her breathing shallow and uneven. The silence in the cab changed texture. It wasn't the peaceful solitude of a long haul, but a heavy, loaded silence filled with potential disaster. I reached across the console, a breach of the distance I usually kept from the world. My hand brushed her forehead, checking her temperature. Her skin was clammy, cold despite the heater blasting at full strength. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, seeking the warmth of my hand. It was a small, unconscious movement, but it sent a jolt through me. I wasn't used to being the anchor. I was the one who passed through, the ghost on the highway. Gravel crunched under the tires, signaling the end of the haul and the beginning of a night without a map. The engine died, severing the mechanical umbilical cord that had pulled us through the mud. The silence that rushed in to fill the void wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressed down by the storm outside. Through the rain-lashed windshield, my cabin was just a dark shape against the trembling pines, a structure of timber and stone that I had built to be the one static point in a life defined by velocity. It wasn't a home in the traditional sense. It was a waypoint, a place where I stored the silence I couldn't carry on the road. Now, I was bringing noise into it, the chaotic, unpredictable noise of another human being. Getting her down from the cab was a negotiation with gravity. I opened the door, and the wind immediately tried to tear it from my grip. Claire looked at the drop to the ground like it was a canyon. I didn't ask. I just moved. I stepped onto the running board, reaching up to take her weight. She slid into me, her legs giving way the moment they touched the metal step. For a few seconds, I held her completely. Her face was pressed against the rough nylon of my jacket, her breath hot and ragged against my neck. It was an intimacy I hadn't prepared for. On the road, you pass people at 70 miles an hour. You don't hold them while they shake apart. I wrapped my arm around her waist, locking her to my side, creating a shared center of gravity that kept us both upright on the slick gravel. The walk to the porch was a blur of rain and mud, a three-legged race against the elements. When I finally got the heavy oak door open and pulled us across the threshold, the change was instantaneous. The storm didn't just stop, it was exiled. The air inside was still and dry, carrying the deep, resinous scent of cedar and the ghost of wood smoke from fires past. It was a smell that usually meant solitude, but tonight it smelled like sanctuary. I kicked the door shut behind us, the heavy latch falling into place with a sound like a vault closing. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled to a dull, distant throb. I guided her to the leather sofa that dominated the center of the room. She sank into it, as if her strings had been cut, curling into the corner, knees drawn up to her chest. She looked small against the dark, worn leather, a splash of pale blue scrub and pale skin in a room built of earth tones and shadows. I didn't speak. Words felt too thin, too flimsy. Instead, I moved to the wood stove. My hands, usually gripping a steering wheel, found the familiar rhythm of kindling and matches. The fire caught quickly, the dry wood snapping as the flames licked upward, casting a sudden, dancing orange light across the room. It chased the shadows back into the corners and painted Claire's face in soft, flickering gold. I left her there for a moment, retreating to the small kitchen. My movements were efficient, practiced. I wasn't a doctor, I didn't have her training, but I knew how to maintain a machine. And right now, her body was a machine that had taken a hit. I gathered ice packs from the freezer, wrapping them in thin towels with the same precision I used to secure a load. I pulled the heavy wool blanket from the back of the armchair. This was my domain. Out here, help wasn't coming. I was the ambulance, the hospital, and the recovery ward. I carried the supplies back to the living room, the ice crunching softly in my grip. When I returned, she hadn't moved. The firelight revealed the truth the darkness had hidden. Without the context of the hospital, without the white coat or the clipboard or the sterile lights, she wasn't a doctor. She was just a woman in pain. The authority that she had tried to cling to in the truck had evaporated, leaving something raw and achingly human in its wake. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash, the shock finally settling into her bones. Watching her, I felt a strange protective anger flare in my chest, at the storm, at the road, at the exhaustion that had put her in that ditch. I knelt beside the sofa, the floorboards hard under my knees, and reached out to drape the blanket over her shoulders. She flinched at the movement, then stopped. She looked at me with sudden, lucid clarity, the fog of the concussion parting just enough for me to see the person behind the trauma. And the air between us thickened, charged with an unspoken question. "I need to check for flail chest," she murmured, her voice thick, trying to summon a professional authority that her body couldn't support. Her hands fluttered toward her own ribcage, fingers trembling too violently to be of any use. She was trying to retreat behind the shield of her training, to treat herself as just another anatomy chart to be assessed and filed away. It was a valiant attempt at dissociation, but the grimace that twisted her mouth when she tried to shift her weight gave her away. "You're not checking anything," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "Your hands are shaking like a leaf. Let me do it." I didn't wait for permission. I moved with the same deliberate speed I used when checking the rig before a long haul. Efficient, necessary, devoid of hesitation. But as I reached for the hem of her scrub top, the clinical detachment I was aiming for fractured. This wasn't steel or rubber. This was warm, living weight. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my knuckles brushing the soft cotton, suddenly acutely aware of the intimacy of the act. We were strangers, thrown together by physics and bad weather, and now I was about to cross a line that usually took months to reach. "Tell me where it hurts," I said softly. "Left side," she breathed, her eyes squeezing shut. "Impact point." I lifted the blue fabric slowly, peeling it back just enough to reveal the curve of her ribs. The breath hissed out of me. The skin there wasn't pale anymore. It was a canvas of violence. A dark, angry bloom of violet and mottled black spread across her side, the shape of the center console imprinted on her flesh. It looked brutal against the softness of her stomach, a stark reminder of the force that had spun her off the road. "It's bad," I admitted, keeping my voice flat to hide the wince I felt internally. "But the bone feels intact. I don't see any displacement." I reached for the towel-wrapped ice pack. "This is going to sting." I pressed the cold pack against the angry heat of the bruise. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a sob, and her hand shot out, gripping my wrist. Her fingers were strong, desperate, digging into the leather of my watch band. It wasn't a push away. It was a plea for grounding. I didn't pull back. I held the ice steady with one hand and let my other hand settle on her shoulder, a heavy, warm counterweight to the shock of the cold. "Breathe," I instructed, watching the rise and fall of her chest. "Just breathe through it." We stayed like that for a long moment, the fire crackling in the grate, the storm throwing itself against the walls of the cabin. The silence between us shifted again. It wasn't fearful anymore. It was heavy with a different kind of tension. My thumb brushed the hollow of her collarbone, an unconscious, soothing motion, and I felt the tension slowly bleed out of her frame. Her grip on my wrist loosened, but she didn't let go. "I shouldn't have been on the road," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes opening to fix on the ceiling beams. I knew I was too tired. "We all think we can push a few more miles," I said. "The white line lies to you." It wasn't just the miles, she confessed, and the raw pain in her voice had nothing to do with her ribs. "I lost a kid 4 hours ago. Trauma bay. He was the same age as my brother." She turned her head, looking at me, and the professional mask was completely gone. Her eyes were wet, unguarded pools of grief. I did everything right. The protocol, the fluids, the compression, but I couldn't fix it. The attending said to go home, to sleep it off, but I couldn't hear anything but the flat line. I just wanted to drive until the sound stopped. I looked at her. Really looked at her. Beneath the bruising and the exhaustion, I saw the crushing weight she carried. It was a weight I knew well. The burden of things you can't control, the miles you can't get back. She wasn't just a doctor running on fumes. She was a woman fleeing a ghost. "The road doesn't fix it," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "It just gives you more time to think about it." "I know," she whispered. "I know that now." She shivered again, and I adjusted the blanket, tucking it tighter around her, my hands lingering for a second too long on the curve of her shoulder. The ice was cold against her skin, but the proximity burned, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. And I realized with a start that I had forgotten the sheer, terrifying weight of being this close to another person. "You can't sleep," I said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the only medical order I was qualified to give, and I delivered it with the same flat, uncompromising tone I used for dispatchers who tried to push my logbook limits. The protocol for a concussion is cruel in its simplicity. You have to keep the brain engaged just when it most desperately wants to shut down. I sat in the armchair opposite her, a mug of black coffee steaming in my hands, acting as the sentinel against the dark. The room had narrowed down to this: the firelight, the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof, and the heavy, terrified weight of her eyelids. "Just 5 minutes," she murmured, her head lolling against the back of the sofa. "I just need to close them for 5 minutes." "No," I said, leaning forward, using my voice to bridge the gap between us. Open them, Claire. Look at me. She obeyed, but it was a struggle. Her pupils were sluggish, swimming in a sea of exhaustion that I recognized intimately. To keep her tethered to the room, I had to keep her talking. I had to bypass the usual social defenses that strangers erect and go straight to the bone. The fire crackled, a sharp sound in the quiet, and the shadows danced on the walls, creating a capsule where the rest of the world ceased to exist. In here, there were no schedules, no patients, no flooded roads, just the two of us, suspended in amber. Talk to me, I commanded softly. Tell me why you were on that road, the real reason. She blinked, focusing on the fire. I told you, the patient. That's the event, I corrected. That's not the reason. You were driving like you were trying to outrun your own shadow. I know that speed. I've driven it. She looked at me then, really looked at me, her gaze piercing through the haze of her injury. And why do you drive? She countered, her voice gaining a sudden, brittle strength. You're out there every night. Is it just the paycheck? I took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding me. Precision, I said. I drive because the road doesn't ask questions. It doesn't want anything from me except attention. When I'm in the cab, everything is math. Speed, distance, weight, fuel. It's a closed loop. There's no room for noise. My life, before the truck, it was too loud. Too many people wanting pieces of me I didn't have left to give. The white line is the only thing I've found that keeps the chaos organized. She softened, her shoulders dropping as the truth of it settled over her. The noise, she whispered, as if tasting the word. God, the noise. In the ER, it never stops. Even when it's quiet, it's not silent. The monitors, the paging system, the ventilation, it's a constant hum of potential disaster. And the expectations. They weigh more than the lead aprons in radiology. You have to be perfect, every second, for 36 hours straight. And when you're not, when you're just human, her voice cracked, fracturing under the pressure she had been carrying alone. I just wanted silence. I thought if I drove far enough, the beeping in my head would stop. We're a pair then, I said, the admission slipping out before I could check it. Two professionals running for the quiet. You chose a sedan, I chose an 18-wheeler. But we're both just trying to find a place where the signal stops. The dynamic in the room shifted. The clinical distance I had tried to maintain evaporated. We weren't rescuer and victim anymore, or driver and doctor. We were just two women, exhausted by the demands of our respective worlds, finding a strange, jagged kind of common ground in the wreckage of the night. She looked at me, her eyes dark and unmasked, and I felt a pull that had nothing to do with gravity. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and the distance between the sofa and the armchair felt impossible to maintain. The armchair felt like a watchtower, a remote outpost separated from the reality of the sofa by 3 feet of braided rug that might as well have been a canyon. I couldn't stay there. The clinical distance I was trying to maintain was fraying under the silent weight of the room. Let me check your eyes again, I said. It was a lie, or at least a convenient half-truth. I needed to see her pupils, yes, to ensure the concussion wasn't deepening into something darker. But more than that, I needed to close the gap. I moved from the safety of the chair to the floor beside the sofa, my knees settling onto the wool rug. The shift in perspective was jarring. Suddenly, I wasn't looking down at a patient from the height of my control. I was looking across at a woman, on her level, the hierarchy of care collapsing into simple, terrifying proximity. Up close, the clinical reality of the accident faded, replaced by a sensory immediacy that made my pulse hammer a frantic rhythm in my throat. The sharp chemical tang of the antiseptic wipes I'd used earlier was evaporating, giving way to something far more dangerous. The scent of rain-damp hair, the salt of dried tears, and the warm, undeniable musk of skin. It was the smell of life, messy and vital, invading a room that had smelled only of wood smoke, cedar, and solitude for as long as I could remember. I shone the penlight into her eyes, my hand steady through sheer force of will, but my breath caught in my chest. Her pupils constricted, reacting to the light, but her gaze didn't waver. She looked past the harsh beam, straight at me, with a vulnerability that felt like a physical touch against my own guarded skin. "You're still with me," I murmured, clicking the light off. The room plunged back into the soft, flickering amber of the firelight, the shadows softening the edges of the world. "Barely," she whispered. Her voice was a thread, fraying at the edges, stripped of all the professional armor she wore like a second skin. She reached out then. It wasn't a calculated move. Her hand drifted from the edge of the blanket and found mine, where it rested on the leather cushion. Her fingers were cool, her palm soft against the calluses of my own hand, a hand shaped by steering wheels, gear shifts, and the rough work of the road. She squeezed, a weak, trembling pressure that wasn't just gratitude, it was an anchor. She was drifting in the dark water of shock and exhaustion, and I was the piling she was clinging to. I turned my hand over, lacing my fingers through hers, the fit startlingly natural. The contact sent a shockwave up my arm, a current of heat that bypassed my brain and went straight to the center of my chest, dismantling defenses I hadn't realized I was still holding. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, the promise heavy and absolute in the quiet room. We stayed like that, frozen in the amber light. The storm outside was a distant memory. The only weather that mattered was the low-pressure system developing right here on the rug. Her eyes dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. The question was there, hanging in the space between us, stripped of all pretense. It would have been so easy to lean forward. The distance was negligible, inches of air that felt charged with static. I could feel the ghost of the movement before I even made it, the magnetic pull to close that final gap, to taste the rain and the fear and the life on her lips. The air between us was thick enough to choke on, vibrating with the kind of tension that usually precedes a collision. But then I saw the bruise darkening on her jaw. I felt the tremor still running through her hand. She was hurt. She was compromised by pain and adrenaline, and I was the one in control. To cross that line now, while she was reeling, felt like a violation of the trust she'd placed in me when she climbed into my truck. I pulled back. It took every ounce of discipline I had, the same ironclad discipline that kept me in my lane on black ice when every instinct screamed to break. I squeezed her hand once, firmly, then released it to reach for the blanket. "You need to sleep," I said, my voice rougher than before, thick with the things I wasn't saying. I pulled the wool up to her chin, tucking the edges around her shoulders with a tenderness that surprised me. My knuckles brushed her cheek, a fleeting, unauthorized caress that seared my skin. She looked at me, understanding dawning in her eyes. She didn't look rejected. She looked seen. "Thank you," she breathed, her eyes finally fluttering shut. Sleep finally claimed her, but I stayed awake, memorizing the rhythm of her breath against the quiet of the room. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a silence so absolute, it felt loud. The light that filtered through the blinds wasn't the soft, amber glow of the fire anymore. It was stark, white, and unforgiving. It exposed everything. The dust motes dancing in the air, the ash in the grate, and the undeniable reality of the woman sleeping on my sofa. Night allows for a certain suspension of disbelief, a blurring of lines between strangers. Morning demands clarity. I stood in the kitchen, the cold slate tiles grounding me, listening to the percolator. The sound of a spoon chiming against ceramic felt startlingly intimate, a domestic note in a house that usually only heard the sounds of one person surviving. Making coffee is usually a mechanical act for me, a fuel stop. But today, it felt like an offering. I poured 2 mugs, black for me, sugar for her, a guess based on the bitterness of the life she'd described last night. When I turned, she was awake. She was sitting up, wincing as her bruised ribs protested the movement. In the harsh daylight, the bruising was vivid, a map of violence painted in purple and green across her jaw and arm. But her eyes were clear. The concussion haze had receded, leaving behind a sharp, assessing intelligence that watched me cross the room. I handed her the mug. Our fingers brushed, dry and warm this time, lacking the desperate clamor of the night before, but holding a new, quiet weight. "Room service," I said, keeping my voice light to mask the sudden tightness in my chest. She took a sip, closing her eyes as the steam hit her face. "Better than the hospital cafeteria," she murmured, her voice raspy with sleep. She set the mug down on her knee, her gaze drifting over the cabin, then settling on me. The professional mask she wore like armor was trying to reassemble itself. I could see her straightening her spine, checking her internal vitals, but it fit looser now. There were cracks in the porcelain. "I survived the night," she said, a small, crooked smile touching her lips. "Thanks to the unauthorized medical intervention." It was a tease, a tentative bridge being built over the chasm of the previous night's vulnerability. "I've hauled fragile cargo before," I countered, leaning against the mantel. "You just required a bit more bubble wrap." We drank in silence for a moment, but it wasn't the heavy, loaded silence of the storm. It was lighter, almost companionable. We were two people who had seen each other at breaking points and decided not to look away. "You stayed awake," she said, not asking. It was a statement of fact. "I saw you watching." I didn't deny it. "Protocol," I lied, though we both knew the concussion protocol didn't require me to memorize the way the firelight caught in her hair. "I had to make sure you didn't drift off into a coma on my watch. Too much paperwork." She laughed, a genuine sound that surprised us both, but it cut off sharply as she moved, a grimace tightening her face. The pain was still there, a physical anchor to the crash, but beneath the pain there was a hum of attraction, a low-frequency vibration that the morning light couldn't wash away. Then the world intruded. It started with a low buzz against the wood of the side table. Her phone. The storm must have knocked out the towers, and the morning clear skies brought the signal back with a vengeance. The screen lit up, flooding the dim room with artificial light, a cascade of notifications scrolling endlessly. Missed calls, texts, hospital admin, mom. The bubble popped. I watched her posture shift, the doctor taking over the woman. She reached for the device, her hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before grabbing it. The sheer volume of the outside world forcing its way in was violent. I saw her flinch, not from pain, but from the sudden weight of expectation landing back on her shoulders. She stared at the screen as if it were a bomb. The solitude we'd cultivated, the fragile peace of the morning, was shattered by the digital demand of a system that didn't care about crashes or exhaustion. "I have to," she started, staring at the screen, the anxiety flooding back into her eyes. "They've been calling all night." "I know," I said, stepping back, giving her the space she suddenly needed. "The tow truck is already on its way. I called them when I got up." The relief on her face was mixed with something else. Regret, maybe? Or just the reluctance to leave a place where the noise stopped. The sound of tires on gravel outside wasn't a rescue. It sounded like an eviction. The tow truck arrived too soon, breaking the spell we had woven out of rain, shadows, and shared silence. The arrival of the tow truck was a jarring intrusion of mechanics and noise into a morning that had been defined by soft light and coffee. Miller, the driver, was a man I'd known for years. A good man, efficient with a winch and a chain. But watching him hook up the crumpled silver sedan felt like watching a crime scene being cleared. The violence of the crash was being erased, hoisted up on hydraulics and secured with steel cables, leaving nothing behind but tire tracks in the mud and a few shards of plastic glinting in the sun. Claire stood by the gate, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She was guarding her bruised ribs, yes, but she was also guarding something else. We had stepped out of the cabin's timeless bubble and back into the harsh, linear timeline of the real world, and the transition was clumsy. The easy, quiet intimacy of the breakfast table had evaporated the moment we opened the front door. We were two professionals again, a driver and a doctor, standing in the damp gravel, pretending we hadn't just shared the longest, most vulnerable night of our lives. "I'll wire you for the tow," she said, her voice tight. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching her car, her lifeline, being shackled to the flatbed. She was trying to make this transactional. If she paid for it, it was a service, a roadside assistance call, not a connection. It was safer that way. "Don't," I said, leaning against the damp wood of the fence post. "Miller owes me a favor. We're square." She turned to me then, her eyes searching my face. The morning sun was merciless, catching the exhaustion still lingering in the purple shadows under her eyes, but the panic was gone. In its place was a hesitation that made my heart hammer a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. She stepped closer, invading my personal space for the last time. The air between us didn't just warm up, it tightened, pulling taut like a wire. She reached out, her hand hovering near the sleeve of my jacket before dropping to her side. It was an aborted gesture, a ghost of the touch she had given me on the rug, and the absence of it burned more than the contact would have. "I don't know how to," she started, then stopped, frustration flickering across her face. "I'm usually better at discharges. I have a script." "There's no paperwork for this," I said softly. "You just go. You heal." She looked at my mouth. It was a deliberate, lingering glance that felt more intimate than a handshake, a silent acknowledgement of the line we had walked right up to, but hadn't crossed. "Thank you," she said. The words waited. For the silence. And for the noise. Then she turned, climbed into the high cab of the tow truck, and didn't look back. I watched them disappear around the bend of the gravel road, the silver sedan bobbing sadly behind the truck like a captured animal. When the sound of the engine faded, the silence rushed back in. But it wasn't the sanctuary I had built. It was heavy. It was suffocating. I went back inside. The cabin felt cavernous. The fire had died down to cold ash. The 2 mugs sat on the table, one with a faint lipstick stain on the rim, a stark red mark on my monochrome life. I washed them, the sound of water loud and aggressive in the empty kitchen. I folded the blanket she had used, smoothing the wool with hands that felt too large and clumsy. It still smelled like her, that faint, clean scent of rain, antiseptic, and skin. I put it away, but the smell lingered, haunting the room like a phantom limb. I tried to settle into my chair, to pick up my book, to resume the routine that had kept me safe for years. But the words swam on the page. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the things we hadn't said. 3 days later, I was back on the haul. The I-5 corridor, a stretch of road I knew better than the veins in my own hands. Usually, this was where I found my peace. The rhythmic thump of the tires, the hum of the diesel engine, the world blurring past in a stream of gray and green. It was supposed to be my meditation. But tonight, the cab felt haunted. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, expecting to see a pale figure in scrubs, expecting to hear the shallow hitch of her breath or the murmur of medical jargon. The seat was empty, occupied only by the road atlas and the cooler, but the space felt charged, waiting. I realized then, somewhere around mile marker 402, that I had been lying to myself for a decade. I hadn't built a fortress of solitude because I loved the quiet. I had built a waiting room. I had been driving in circles, keeping the world at arm's length, waiting for someone reckless enough to crash through the walls. And now that she had, the walls didn't look like protection anymore. They looked like a cage. I was tired of the silence. I was tired of the control. I wanted the chaos back. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of radio silence, of driving until my eyes burned, of sleeping in a bed that felt too big. I checked my phone more than I ever had in my life, feeling foolish every time the screen remained dark. Then, on a Tuesday, parked in a lot 300 miles from home, it happened. The phone I rarely used buzzed against the dash. A number I didn't save, but knew by heart. The phone buzz wasn't a call. It was a location pin. Here. I looked up through the bug-splattered windshield. The truck stop was a sprawling grid of asphalt and idling engines, a neon-lit purgatory for the weary. But there, standing under the harsh halo of a floodlight, was Claire. She wasn't in scrubs. She was wearing dark denim and a leather jacket that looked too new, leaning against a rental car with a casual defiance that stopped my breath. The wreckage of the storm was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly lucid reality. I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud that echoed the sudden, erratic rhythm of my heart. The air smelled of diesel and frying grease, a sharp, industrial contrast to the cedar and rain of our first night. Walking toward her felt different than walking toward the crash. There was no adrenaline to hide behind, no medical emergency to dictate the terms of engagement. There was just the raw, stripped-down truth of a woman who had driven 300 miles to find a truck driver she barely knew. Up close, the transformation was absolute. The bruising that had mapped the violence of the accident across her jaw was gone, fading into memory. Her eyes were clear, sharp, unclouded by concussion or shock. She looked rested, back in command of her faculties, the efficient doctor who could run a trauma bay without blinking. But as I stopped a few feet away, I saw it, the crack in the armor. Her hands were shoved deep into her pockets, but her gaze sought mine with the same naked vulnerability I had seen by the firelight. She was steady, yes, but she was searching. "You're hard to track down," she said, her voice cutting through the low rumble of the idling trucks. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. "I move around," I replied, the words feeling inadequate. "It's the nature of the beast." "It's a good way to hide," she countered, stepping closer. The distance between us shrank, the air thickening with a tension that was no longer about survival, but about intent. I went back to the ER. The noise, it's still there. The alarms, the panic, the constant demand for perfection. But for the last 2 weeks, every time the chaos got too loud, I closed my eyes and heard the rain on your roof. I realized I didn't want the silence of an empty road. I wanted the silence of your cabin. I wanted the person who knew how to sit in the dark with me. The confession hung between us, heavier than the humid night air. I looked at her, standing firm in the grease-stained parking lot, and the realization hit me with the force of a blowout. I hadn't just pulled her out of a ditch. She had pulled me out of my own loop. "I thought I was rescuing you," I admitted, my voice dropping to a register reserved for secrets. "But the cabin has been too quiet since you left. The solitude, it stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like a waiting room. I think I was just waiting for you to wake up." "I'm awake," she whispered. The tension broke, not with a word, but with a shift in gravity. The 3 feet of asphalt separating us vanished. I didn't think about professional boundaries or the wisdom of the road. I reached out, and she met me halfway. Her hands came out of her pockets, warm and solid, gripping the lapels of my jacket. The contact was electric, a sudden circuit closing after weeks of static. I pulled her in, my hands finding the curve of her waist, the leather of her jacket cool under my palms, but her body radiating heat. My thumbs brushed the pulse point at her neck, feeling the rapid flutter of life there. The kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision of precision and strength, clear and consensual and absolutely grounding. Her mouth was warm, tasting of coffee and the mint of a long drive, moving against mine with an unflinching certainty that erased the miles between us. It was a merging of 2 worlds, the clinical and the visceral, the stationary and the mobile. When we finally broke apart, breathless and anchored, I pulled her into a hug that squeezed the air from our lungs, her face buried in the crook of my neck. "I don't know where this goes," she murmured against my skin. "I still have shifts. You still have the hall." "We have maps," I said, resting my chin on her head, looking out at the endless line of the highway. "We'll navigate it, 1 mile at a time." The cab of the truck is no longer a fortress of solitude. It's messy now. There are 2 coffees in the cup holders, one black, one with sugar. The silence is still there, but it's shared, filled with the quiet hum of a connection that survived the crash. Sometimes, the wrong turn on a stormy night leads to the only destination that ever really mattered. If you've ever found clarity in the middle of a storm, subscribe for more stories about the quiet moments that change everything.